She was just a maid, an ordinary girl born into a world that often ignored people like her. Her name was Isabella, and her life had always been about survival, about working hard to make ends meet, about putting everyone else's needs above her own. She came from a humble village where dreams were considered luxuries that no one could afford, and hope was often swallowed by the heavy weight of poverty. Isabella had learned early on that life was not fair, but she had also learned that kindness cost nothing. That was the one treasure she carried with her everywhere she went. When she was hired to work as a maid in the grand mansion on the hill, she had no idea that her life was about to change forever. The mansion belonged to one of the richest men in the country, a billionaire named Alexander Hayes. His name was whispered with reverence in business circles, and in society he was known for his power, influence, and wealth. He owned companies that spanned the globe, towers that touched the clouds, and fleets of cars that gleamed like jewels. People saw him as untouchable, a man who lived in a world far beyond the reach of ordinary lives. To Isabella, he was nothing more than her employer. She had promised herself that she would never let her eyes wander toward impossible dreams. Her duty was simple: to clean the marble floors, polish the glass walls, and keep her head bowed in the presence of greatness. She had grown used to being invisible, used to blending into the background. In her mind, the wealthy lived in a different universe, one she had no right to even glance at. But fate has its own ways of playing with lives. The first time Alexander noticed her was not when she was in uniform, quietly dusting the library shelves, but when he overheard her singing softly to herself as she worked. Isabella never meant for anyone to hear her voice. Music had been her secret, her only escape from the weight of reality. In the emptiness of the mansion's halls, she would hum old songs her mother used to sing, melodies filled with warmth and longing. One evening, as she finished tidying the study, Alexander entered unexpectedly. He was tired from meetings, his mind weighed down with decisions worth billions. Yet when he heard her gentle voice, he paused. There was something raw, something pure in her singing that disarmed him. For a moment, the endless noise of his powerful world fell silent, replaced by a melody that seemed to reach straight into his guarded heart. He didn't speak to her that night, but he remembered. Days turned into weeks, and though Isabella always tried to remain unseen, Alexander's eyes began to seek her out. He was struck by the way she carried herself with quiet dignity, even in the most menial tasks. There was a grace in her humility, a strength in her silence. He had known countless women, women draped in diamonds and designer gowns, women who fought for his attention at glamorous parties. But none of them had the simplicity, the authenticity that Isabella radiated without even trying. What fascinated him even more was her indifference. She never looked at him with awe or hunger, never spoke to him unless duty required it. She seemed immune to his wealth, untouched by his aura of power. To a man who was accustomed to admiration and flattery, her quiet detachment was strangely captivating. Isabella, however, was completely unaware of the growing attention. She lived in her own little world, focused only on her responsibilities. She sent most of her wages back to her family in the village, keeping barely enough to survive. Every coin she earned carried the weight of her siblings' education, her mother's medicine, and her father's broken dreams. She did not have the luxury of thinking about romance, let alone about a man whose life was galaxies away from hers. But Alexander found ways to draw closer. He began asking small questions: her name, her background, her family. At first, Isabella answered with caution, fearing that any word out of place could cost her job. Yet slowly she realized he wasn't mocking her, nor was he trying to pry for amusement. He listened, truly listened. For a man who commanded boardrooms and conquered markets, his attentiveness was disarming. He was used to people listening to him, but with Isabella it was different. He wanted to hear her. Their conversations were brief, often interrupted by the demands of his world, but each one planted seeds of connection. Alexander found himself longing for the moments when he could steal a few words with her, moments when he could see her eyes light up as she spoke of her dreams, even though she considered them too small to matter. He noticed the calluses on her hands, the way she sometimes winced when lifting heavy buckets, the exhaustion she tried to hide behind a polite smile. It bothered him in ways he couldn't explain. For the first time in years, his heart ached not for himself, but for someone else. And so, without fully realizing it, Alexander Hayes, the man who had built empires and stood unshaken against storms, was falling in love with a maid. Isabella, on the other hand, remained guarded. She respected him, admired his intelligence and discipline, but she constantly reminded herself that men like him did not belong in the same story as women like her. She was a worker. He was a billionaire. The distance was too vast, too impossible to cross. Yet love has a way of erasing lines. As the weeks unfolded, the invisible thread between them tightened. Alexander would find excuses to linger in the hallways where Isabella worked, asking her questions that seemed simple but always carried a deeper intention. What book she liked to read when she had the chance. What her favorite flower was, whether she had ever seen the ocean. He noticed how her eyes sparkled when she spoke of simple things, like the joy of sitting under a tree during summer, or the memory of her little brother chasing fireflies back in the village. He began to realize that the world she carried inside her heart was richer than all the treasures he owned. For Alexander, wealth had long ago lost its magic. He had everything, yet he often felt empty, as though he were walking through a palace of glass with no warmth, no laughter, no genuine connection. But Isabella's world, though humble, was filled with meaning. She treasured life in a way he had forgotten how to. Still, he hesitated. He was a man used to control, yet love was not something he could command. He feared that if he spoke too soon, she would retreat, and the fragile bond they had built would shatter. So he chose patience, allowing time to weave trust between them. Isabella, however, was not blind to the small changes. She noticed the way he looked at her sometimes, the way his voice softened when speaking to her, the way he seemed almost relieved to leave behind his endless meetings just to have a conversation about something ordinary. She told herself not to think too much of it. She reminded herself over and over again that men like Alexander lived in a universe where love was often fleeting, where people were drawn by power, not by truth. She couldn't risk her heart. She had seen too many broken stories in her village, too many women who had been fooled by promises they couldn't hold. But no matter how much she tried to ignore it, her heart betrayed her. At night, when she lay on her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, she found herself replaying the sound of his laughter, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the warmth in his voice when he asked about her family. Against her will, a fragile dream began to grow. The turning point came one stormy evening. The sky rumbled with thunder and rain hammered against the glass walls of the mansion. Isabella was alone in the grand kitchen finishing her chores when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw Alexander, drenched from the rain, his usually composed appearance replaced by a rare vulnerability. He had been caught in the storm returning from a business meeting, and something in his expression told her that it wasn't just the weather weighing on him. Without thinking, she rushed to fetch a towel and handed it to him. Their hands brushed briefly, and in that touch something unspoken passed between them. He looked at her with eyes that carried not the power of a billionaire, but the quiet longing of a man who was simply tired of being alone. "Why do you care so much?" he asked softly, almost to himself. Isabella hesitated, unsure how to answer, but then she said the only thing that felt true. "Because everyone deserves kindness." Those words pierced deeper than she could have imagined. For years, Alexander had been surrounded by people who wanted something from him: money, influence, opportunities. Kindness had become a rare gift, something he could scarcely trust. Yet here she was, offering it freely, without asking for anything in return. That night, as the storm raged outside, their connection grew stronger than ever. They spoke for hours, sharing stories they had never told anyone else. He confessed the loneliness of his empire, how success had cost him genuine friendships, how every room full of admirers still left him feeling utterly alone. She shared her struggles, her family's hardships, her dreams of one day giving her siblings the education she never had. By the time the storm faded, something irreversible had happened. They were no longer just a billionaire and his maid. They were two souls who had found in each other the piece of themselves they didn't know was missing. But love stories are never simple. The mansion was not empty of eyes, and whispers soon began to circulate among the staff. Some noticed the unusual attention Alexander gave Isabella. Others resented her for it, jealous of the closeness she seemed to share with a man who was otherwise unreachable. Rumors spread quickly, like wildfire carried by the wind. Isabella began to feel the weight of disapproving glances, the sting of cruel words spoken behind her back. One evening, another maid confronted her, spitting venomous accusations that she was using her charm to climb into wealth, that she was a gold digger pretending to be innocent. Isabella's cheeks burned with humiliation, but she held her ground. She had no such intentions, and the thought of being misunderstood pained her deeply. She had never wanted anything more than to do her work with dignity. When Alexander learned of the gossip, his anger was swift. He defended her fiercely, making it clear that no one had the right to insult her. But in doing so, he only fueled the rumors further. People began to say that she had bewitched him, that she was manipulating the billionaire's heart. Isabella was torn. On one hand, her feelings for Alexander had blossomed into something undeniable. On the other, she feared that being near him would only destroy her reputation and make her family ashamed. She even considered resigning, leaving the mansion to escape the poison of jealousy. But every time she thought of leaving, her heart ached with a pain she could not bear. Alexander, too, wrestled with his emotions. He knew that pursuing her would invite scandal, that society would never easily accept the idea of a billionaire falling in love with a maid. His business associates would mock him, the media would twist the story, and people would question his judgment. Yet none of that mattered when he thought of her. For the first time in his life, he didn't care about the world's opinion. He cared only about the woman who had taught him the meaning of kindness. One night, unable to endure the silence any longer, he finally confessed. His words were not wrapped in grandeur, not decorated with promises of wealth or luxury. Instead, they were simple, trembling with honesty. He told her that he had fallen in love with her, that he saw in her a truth he had been searching for his entire life, that without her, all his riches meant nothing. Isabella's heart thundered. She wanted to believe him, wanted to surrender to the love that had been blooming in her chest. But fear gripped her. Fear that this was all a dream too fragile to survive the weight of reality. And so, with tears in her eyes, she whispered, "I can't." Alexander's heart sank, but he did not give up. Isabella's refusal haunted Alexander. It was not rejection born of dislike, but rejection rooted in fear. He could see it in her trembling eyes, in the way her voice broke when she said the words. She loved him too, he was certain of it, but she was terrified of what loving him might cost. That night he lay awake in his vast, empty room, realizing for the first time that all the wealth in the world meant nothing if the woman he cherished was too afraid to stand by his side. He knew he had to prove it to her, not with riches, not with power, but with something he had rarely offered anyone: patience, persistence, and sincerity. In the days that followed, Alexander did something no one expected. He stepped away from the endless noise of his empire. He postponed meetings, skipped dinners with influential figures, and began spending more time within the mansion, where Isabella was. But instead of flaunting his wealth, he sought out the quiet corners where she worked, asking about her day, helping her carry heavy buckets, even rolling up his sleeves to assist with simple chores. The staff watched in stunned silence. The billionaire who once walked with an air of untouchable authority was now polishing silver beside the maid he loved. Some mocked quietly, but others softened, realizing that his devotion was not a performance, but a truth. Isabella, however, grew even more conflicted. Every time Alexander did something kind, every time he looked at her with those earnest eyes, her walls crumbled a little more. But then she would remember the cruel whispers, the judgmental stares, and the vast distance between their worlds. Her heart was torn in two directions, one that longed for him and one that screamed at her to protect herself. The breaking point came when Isabella received a letter from her family. Her mother's health had worsened, and her younger siblings were struggling to stay in school. The meager wages she sent each month were not enough. Tears blurred her vision as she read the words, and despair filled her chest. She felt powerless, trapped between the weight of her family's suffering and her own fragile heart. Alexander found her in the garden that evening, her hands trembling as she held the letter. Without hesitation, he asked what was wrong. She tried to hide it, but the pain was too heavy. Finally, with a trembling voice, she confessed everything: her family's struggles, her fears, her feeling that she could never belong in his world. To her surprise, Alexander didn't offer money. He didn't speak of his billions or suggest grand solutions. Instead, he simply placed his hand gently over hers and said, "You don't have to carry this burden alone. Let me walk beside you." Those words shattered the final walls around her heart. For the first time, Isabella allowed herself to cry in front of him, and as he held her, she realized that love was not about wealth or status. It was about finding someone who saw your pain and chose to stay anyway. But love's test had only just begun. News of their closeness spread beyond the mansion. Soon, society's whispers turned into headlines. The media caught wind of the story: the billionaire and his maid. Paparazzi camped outside the gates, desperate for a photograph of the unlikely pair. Commentators ridiculed Alexander, accusing him of losing his judgment, while others spun cruel stories about Isabella, painting her as a manipulator chasing fortune. The storm was relentless. Every time Isabella stepped outside, she felt the eyes of the world pressing down on her, judging her, tearing her apart. Strangers hurled insults, and social media burned with cruel remarks. She had never asked for this, never wanted the spotlight, yet now she was drowning in it. One evening, overwhelmed by the pressure, Isabella told Alexander that she couldn't endure it any longer. She begged him to let her go, to allow her to leave quietly so he could continue his life without scandal. Her voice broke as she told him that she loved him too much to ruin his reputation. Alexander's heart broke hearing her words, but he knew this was the moment that would define their love. He could not let fear dictate their story. He had spent his entire life building empires, standing against storms that threatened his fortune. But now he faced a storm that threatened his heart, and he would not surrender. The very next day, Alexander made a decision that shocked the world. At a grand charity event filled with cameras and the most powerful figures in the country, he stood on stage and spoke. But instead of announcing a new business venture or donation, he spoke of love. He told the audience about a woman who had taught him the meaning of kindness, a woman who had shown him that true wealth was not measured in money, but in compassion and sincerity. He told them her name, Isabella, and declared without shame that she was the woman he loved. The room fell silent. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some faces twisted in disbelief, others in disdain, but Alexander's voice was unwavering. He did not ask for approval. He did not seek permission. He simply spoke his truth. And in doing so, he silenced the whispers. When Isabella heard the news, tears streamed down her face. For the first time, she realized that Alexander was willing to risk everything for her. Not just his reputation, but his comfort, his carefully constructed image, his untouchable position in society. He had chosen love over pride, truth over pretense. That evening, when he returned to the mansion, Isabella met him at the door. She no longer hid her feelings, no longer let fear guide her. With trembling hands, she reached for him, and in her eyes was a light he had been waiting to see. She whispered the words she had once been too afraid to say: "I love you." In that moment, the world outside no longer mattered. The rumors, the headlines, the judgment, all of it faded. What remained was the unshakable truth of two hearts that had found their home in each other. But love does not end with a confession. It begins there. And though their journey would not be free of challenges, Isabella and Alexander knew they had something far stronger than the storms around them. They had each other, and that was enough. The confession of their love was not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with challenges yet woven with hope. Life did not magically become easier the moment Isabella and Alexander embraced their feelings. In fact, the storm outside grew louder, the criticism sharper, the disbelief more unrelenting. But now they faced it not as individuals, But as a united force, Alexander shielded Isabella from the worst of the chaos, not by hiding her away but by proudly holding her hand wherever they went. Every public appearance was a statement. He was not ashamed of her, and he would not allow anyone to diminish the worth of the woman he loved. Slowly, society began to shift. Some remained stubborn in their judgment, clinging to their prejudices, but others softened, realizing that what they were witnessing was not a scandal but a rare truth. Isabella herself changed too. At first, the glare of cameras and the endless chatter of strangers left her shaken, but she drew strength from Alexander's unwavering presence. She realized that love demanded courage, not the absence of fear but the willingness to stand firm despite it. Each day she grew bolder, no longer the invisible maid who kept her head bowed, but a woman learning to lift her chin with quiet dignity. Her greatest joy, however, came when Alexander reached out to her family. Without fanfare or pride, he arranged the best doctors for her mother, ensuring she received the care she had long been denied. He funded her siblings' education, not as a favor but as an act of love, telling Isabella that her dreams for them were now his dreams too. When her family learned the truth, they wept with gratitude. They saw not just a wealthy man, but a protector, someone who cherished their daughter beyond measure. For Isabella, this was the true proof of his heart. Anyone could make grand promises in the name of love, but Alexander had chosen to step into her world, to carry her burdens as his own. He did not try to change her into something she was not. He did not demand that she forget her roots or abandon the people she loved. Instead, he honored them, and in doing so, he honored her. Seasons changed, and with time, the whispers of doubt turned into murmurs of admiration. The billionaire and his maid became a story not of scandal but of inspiration, a reminder that love could bloom in the most unlikely places. Newspapers that once ridiculed them began to write of their devotion. People who had doubted began to believe, and while Alexander paid little attention to the noise, Isabella smiled quietly, knowing that the truth of their bond was finally shining through. Yet even amid the acceptance, their love remained simple. They did not live in constant extravagance, as one might expect of a billionaire's romance. Instead, they cherished the small things, the evenings spent walking through the garden, the laughter shared over humble meals, the moments of silence where words were unnecessary. Alexander often told Isabella that with her, he had discovered a wealth greater than all the fortunes he had amassed: peace. Years later, as they stood together on the balcony of the mansion where their story had begun, Alexander looked at Isabella with the same awe he had felt the night he first heard her singing. She was no longer just the maid who had once polished the marble floors. She was his partner, his confidant, his greatest treasure, and though the world might still see him as the billionaire who had everything, he knew the truth. He had been empty until her love filled his life. Isabella, too, reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had once believed that love between their worlds was impossible, that she was destined to remain invisible in the shadows of wealth and power, but love had proven her wrong. It had shown her that what mattered was not status or riches, but the courage to see another soul and embrace it fully. She realized now that her greatest strength had always been her heart, and it was that very heart that had captured the man who seemed untouchable to the rest of the world. Together they built a life that honored both their worlds. Isabella continued to support her family and community, using Alexander's resources not for luxury, but to lift others who had once stood where she had. She opened schools, funded scholarships, and created opportunities for the forgotten and overlooked. And every time she extended her hand to help someone rise, Alexander stood beside her, proud and grateful, knowing that her kindness had changed not only him but the lives of countless others. Their love story became a legacy, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. It was a story of courage, of breaking barriers, of defying the expectations of a society that tried to keep them apart. It was a story of a maid who dared to love and a billionaire who dared to choose her, despite the odds. On quiet nights when the world seemed far away, Isabella would still sing softly, just as she had the day he first noticed her. And Alexander would listen, his heart swelling with the same wonder as before. For him, her voice was not just a melody, It was the song that had led him home. And so what began as a tale of two worlds too far apart became a love story that proved one timeless truth. Real love does not ask where you come from, what title you carry, or how much gold lines your pockets. Real love simply sees the soul and chooses it. She had been just a maid, unseen and unremarkable in the eyes of many. But to Alexander, she had always been so much more. She was the woman who taught him that kindness was the rarest jewel, that humility was strength, and that love was the only wealth that truly mattered. In the end, Isabella and Alexander did not live happily ever after in the way fairy tales promise, for life is never without its storms, but they lived truthfully, faithfully, and deeply in love. And that, in the truest sense, was their happily ever after.